Federal government banned TikTok over national security and data privacy issues, amongst a bunch of other things. Yet it's not actually banned just yet, right?
That's correct. There's a window of time until the law becomes effective, but that window of time was in part anticipating the inevitable legal challenges that were going to come. And so, in a real sense, the legal challenges are going to dictate the schedule more than potentially the statute.
Okay, so the company's been given this ultimatum, like divest or ban. What are those two options? Like divest, what does that mean? And or just outright ban, what does that mean for American consumers?
So, um, to me, I think the idea of saying X or we ban you is not really a choice. I don't know if that's
It's
a
an
Hobson's
ultimatum,
choice or
right?
a Morton's fork or what the right terminology is here. It's one of those things with the metaphor of there's a gun to your head, now make a choice. And at that point, there's not really a choice. And so I call this law a ban. I don't really focus on the divestiture option because to me, that's just a compelled activity of the threat of what I consider to be an unconstitutional ban. So X or ban, whatever the X is in my mind, is just a prelude to the risk that the ban will take effect, and that's really the payload of the law. But let's talk a little bit about the divestiture for a moment. That's what Congress has said. Many of the people, the members of Congress who voted for this law, said that they don't want to shut TikTok down. They simply want it in the hands of a new owner. And they
Mm.
expressed, in fact, some concern TikTok would actually shut down the law that they voted for that said, we will shut you down. They said, oh, no, we really don't want TikTok to shut down. We
We
just
want,
want to.
yeah, we want you to sell your operations to an American entity.
Well, I mean, to be clear, it's not just an American entity, although that's the most likely buyer in this circumstance. What the statute does is it says there's some bad countries out there, and if they're investors of a certain percentage who have a share in TikTok or possibly other entities that are also regulated by this law, and then the ban kicks in. But so TikTok could sell to another foreign investor or some consortium that includes foreign investors, but unless they're from a quote bad country, and let's just assume for all relevant purposes, the number one target in this discussion about bad countries is China. There are certainly others, but that's the one that everyone's focused on. So the idea is that Chinese investors, whether it's the official government or some proxies of the government or truly independent investors should not have a significant stake in TikTok. If TikTok could arrange an economic outcome like that, then the ban would not apply. But I just want to reinforce what that's really saying is we're going to dictate the owners of this company. That the government's
Mm.
coming in and saying, as a venue for conversations, we don't like who owns it now. We're going to tell you that you have to find another owner, and we can start to think about how weird that might sound in some other media where we're like, if the government can dictate who is the owner of a company that's engaging in speech in our society, they can dictate whether or not that speech is going to take place. So it's really, even the divestiture is a backdoor way of saying we want to control the speech that's taking place in our country. And
Mm.
that's really what gets to the problem.
Got it. Okay. So there's an immediate timeline for that divest piece, January. Is that correct?
I
They
can't remember the exact date, but
they want to see something
it's
happening.
also it could be extended. Biden has the power to extend it for a few months
Okay.
if he views it as necessary because they're making progress. But let's assume that in the relatively near future, less than a year from now, TikTok will be in new hands or the ban will take effect.
So, but what's happened right now is now they're in the court system over First Amendment rights. I'm going to oversimplify this, and I know that maybe there's an agitation on your side because you're a lawyer. I might not say everything absolutely correctly. It's in the courts. As long as it's in the courts, does it push that deadline out?
The short answer is no. Just being in
Mm.
court doesn't automatically extend the deadline for the ban. However, the court may extend that deadline based on its ruling. And certainly, if TikTok is either victorious in court or if the court believes that it has a good chance of being victorious, TikTok is likely to get interim relief that will extend the deadline until the
Hmm.
final resolution.
All right. Okay. So, according to a bunch of different polls out there, about 50% of Americans support the ban on TikTok, less so amongst younger people. But, like, what kind of evidence do we have that TikTok is a national security threat as it's kind of
I want
been
to go back
seen?
to your poll for a moment because I think that's really interesting that 50% of Americans would support the banning of TikTok, and to me, that's actually really a damning statement on the American population today.
Hmm.
If you were to ask the American people, do you value the First Amendment? Do you value the constitutionally protected freedoms of speech and press? I would guess that a very large percentage would say absolutely. And then if you go and say, here's a ban, but we're not going to tell you that this ban is actually a derogation of the First Amendment. We're just going to say it's a ban. Do you support that? People are like, sure, that sounds great. And there's this divergence between understanding the theory of the Constitution and what it really means in practice that leads to that. Now, of course, part of the reason why the public may have turned on TikTok is because every politician has been bashing it for years. And
Hmm.
because the media has been picking up and amplifying and relaying that and bashing TikTok for years, and TikTok has made some mistakes, and maybe TikTok has some condemnable behavior. And you add all that up, it's surprising that 100% of Americans don't favor banning TikTok.
Yeah.
But what we're really discussing is, would Americans support, if put to a ballot, a law that is clearly designed to censor speech? And the answer is clearly yes. Censorship is a very popular thing so long as people don't think it actually affects them.
I Yeah. So one, it was a 50% amongst the whole population, far less so if you look at the kind of
People who actually are using it
using
and
it.
would be
Yeah,
censored.
right, right. But I also think that it comes from not just the media, but that I hear parents all the time just sitting watching their kids and feeling like this is a problem. So maybe they think they support the ban of TikTok because of mental health reasons as well. But that banning the app is not the way to help your child with their mental health issues.
And I think we're getting a little bit off topic, so I apologize for taking this there. I will note that the empirical evidence really undermines the narrative that social media is a causal agent in the mental
Mm,
health issues posed
hmm.
among our
Right.
children. That's not to say that our children's mental health is in good shape, and it's not to say that social media is irrelevant in that process. But the literature on this consistently has been saying that actually social media is a net positive for children's mental health. But the broader point you're making, which is absolutely correct, is that in addition to the anti China sentiments that are fueling a lot of the rage towards TikTok, there's also the bigger, broader issue of the techlash that
Hmm.
people in general have gotten wary of technology companies. They're too big, they're too powerful, they're too profitable, and they're unaccountable. And those general propositions have become a standard talking point among politicians and the media for many years. And so the accumulated effect of that conditioning has led people to say, if in doubt, I'm anti technology. Now, we were talking earlier about generative AI. That problem is even worse for generative AI. That's one of the reasons why generative AI is doomed, in my opinion, because
Hmm.
there's no breaks or counter narrative that's going to protect generative AI from that regulatory impulse. So, asking, the parents of TikTok users whether or not they would favor banning TikTok. In the end, it's kind of like I, I don't think that they would necessarily even think about it that way. They're like ban all the tech, take it out of their
Yeah.
hands altogether, which is actually what I think no one really wants. And if people were to think about that as the end game, I think they would actually say that actually is truly not what I want.
Part of my career was spent as a researcher, user researcher, usability, that type of stuff. The problem with a lot of surveys is that there are questions that are left off that could give you some clarity. For instance, to what extent do you understand? Or did you know? Could just be a yes, no. Did you know that banning TikTok would have these trickle down effects on your First Amendment rights? I'd love to see what the answer is for supporting the ban, how many people say yes, and then what the answer is supporting the ban again. Because I think what I'm hearing is that uh, the trickle down effects on First Amendment rights, people don't understand that.
It really just shows how vulnerable and at peril our First Amendment rights are.
Hmm.
Because if posed in the wrong way, but maybe even in the right way, people would vote for censorship.
Hmm.
And they definitely would say, as long as it doesn't affect me, I'm happy to take the words out of other people's mouths. And that's been true for millennia. That's part of the human condition. That's not a new problem. That's a very, very ancient one. And so I think that's part of, the TikTok ban is like one little microcosm of this much broader impulse, which is censorship is usually quite popular among the majority. Now, you had asked a question that I never answered, and I want to acknowledge that, and I'm happy to go back to it. You said, what's the evidence against TikTok that it's a
Yes.
national security threat? And we can go there or any other direction you want.
So the evidence is a question I have. I'd love for you to give me your first answer, and then I have some follow up questions.
Okay, so the short answer is we don't, as a public, do not have access to all the evidence that relates to the national security risks that are allegedly posed by TikTok. And there has been some evidence that have been introduced about the interplay between the Chinese government and TikTok that suggested that maybe the Chinese government is intimately involved in TikTok's operations and in theory at that point would have the ability to put their thumb on the scale to decide what content's presented or to suck up the consumer data to use it for nefarious purposes. Some of that evidence is still also in question that's been publicly presented, but the best evidence presumably is the stuff that we as the public have not been told. Now, I will point out that the TikTok ban is not a new thing. The one that we're discussing today is not the first attempt to ban TikTok. And during the Trump era, there was efforts to ban TikTok as well. And in those challenges, at least one of the judges had access to the secret information that was not available to the public at large and still was not persuaded by it. Now, that doesn't answer the question about whether new evidence accrued or if the judge has seen all the evidence, but it simply is a possibility that what we don't know is actually a nothing burger and it's just being a trumped up allegation in order to play on people's fears.
Okay, so there are a bunch of issues that have been brought up to that have been used to support this ban, and a lot of the things it sounds like we don't have the hard evidence, it's just kind of anecdotal. So I just want to go through one and simplify for the audience these issues. So one, we hear a lot about data privacy, that our data is making its way to servers outside of the country, and that data includes tracking and potentially PII information. Is that correct? That's like the one accusation,
That's
right?
an allegation.
Yeah,
And I'm just going to assume that's true. And if you want, I'd like to say a little more about that because that's
sure.
so critical.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, there's really been two primary justifications of the TikTok ban. Primary justification number one is the data privacy concern that China is getting access to American consumer information that they shouldn't have,
Right.
and the other is some other form of concern about the editorial control of TikTok. That it's basically
Disinformation and
it's a
possibly,
Chinese government mouthpiece is I think the short way
yeah,
of putting it.
I think like disinformation or digital warfare of sorts.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the last term, and I might not
Okay,
even use the former. But I
got
think
it.
we're saying the same thing. That the
Yeah.
idea is that what you're seeing on TikTok is designed to weaponize the technology against your current government. And so let's talk about the data privacy concern. And I'm going to start with the premise that the Chinese government has as much data about U.S. consumers as it wants.
Hmm.
And it has that whether or not it's acquiring the information in this backdoor channel through TikTok, which is a highly indirect way of doing it when there's a lot more direct ways to do it. And so, for example, the TikTok ban also had a part that was trying to restrict data brokerage selling information to foreign governments. And to me, that's actually a law that's much more designed to address that concern than a general ban on TikTok. In other words, general ban on TikTok is just a neutron bomb type approach, just wipe everything out. If the real concern is about the movement of data from the U.S. consumers to the Chinese government, then a data broker law helps, but it's still incomplete. There's
Hmm.
still many other ways in which any government can acquire data about consumers. Now, here's the real problem that we have if we're going to take that position as a country, that we do not want the U.S. consumers' data in the hands of the Chinese government. For example, the European Union has repeatedly cut off the movement of European consumer data to the United States because once it gets in the United States, it becomes available to the surveillance operations of the US government.
Hmm.
Um, in other words, if we think that's a problem, we are part of that problem. Our own
Right.
country is engaged in that behavior, and then we need to have a global effort to protect all consumers from the surveillance of domestic and foreign governments who are
Mm.
engaging in behavior that it may be adverse to the population that the government's serving. So to me, I think that it's so awkward for the U.S. to be taking the position that Chinese government might be siphoning data when we literally know the U.S. government is siphoning data and has been penalized for that very behavior.
Okay, so pot calling the kettle black here.
I mean, look, our entire political structure is filled with hypocrisy. I don't
Right.
get any satisfaction pointing out the hypocrisy. I just pointing out for anyone who says, "Wow, that sounds terrible," that the Chinese government might be slurping up U.S. consumer data. I agree with you, but if you're concerned about that, the call is coming from inside the house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you said the accusations that maybe the Chinese government is manipulating the content on the app, and you said you wouldn't call it disinformation and you wouldn't call it digital warfare. What would you call
So I think that the most applicable term might be propaganda. That basically TikTok is becoming a mouthpiece for Chinese government or the communist Chinese party's propaganda.
it? Mm-hmm.
Um, and I will admit I am concerned about government propaganda. And yet, you already know where I'm going with this one. Guess who else repeatedly manipulate social media in order to advance their propaganda agenda? The US does that all the time as well. And so that's not a Chinese problem. That's, again, a government problem. It's something that governments across the globe all engage in. And we need to have a systemic, holistic discussion about that. Trying to address this through this backdoor divest or ban type approach for one app is solving no problem.
Problems, yeah.
It's actually masking the fact that this is just what all governments are doing, and it really gets down to the heart of the problem, which is if we don't trust the Chinese government, we have to ask why we don't trust them, and we ought to ask, do we have those same concerns about the U.S. government? And if we do, we need to harden our systems against our own government. That's where the conversation ought to start.
Yeah, it's funny because two previous episodes talk about when systemic change seems so large, how can you take care of the homestead? And that change really begins with you. I had the founder of the Conscious Entrepreneur Summit on and talk about the conscious you, then the conscious team, then the conscious company. And it sounds like a version of what you were saying is like we're trying to go out and look externally at problems we as the United States when we have our own issues to kind of
I,
realize ourselves.
Yeah, as the axiom goes, every accusation is an admission.
Right.
So everything you're hearing accused against Chinese government is an admission that we're probably doing that too. And I want to step back for a moment because for me, the federal government's effort to ban TikTok is really, I think, an important milestone in the U.S.'s journey as a world leader, shaping the global norms about the relationship between governments and their citizens. And when I grew up, I'm a Gen Xer. There were lots and lots of problems, but there was still a romanticized ideal that the U.S. government was actually above the fray, that other governments were not trustworthy, but the U.S. government was leading the way towards a brighter and better future. And then when we pass things like the TikTok ban, blatantly censorial law designed to deal with threats that are the exact same threats that we are doing ourselves against the globe and maybe our own citizens, I just feel like we've given up some of that romanticized view that I grew up with,
Hmm.
and we're just putting in the dumpster fire.
Yeah.
So to me, all those people are cheering like, "Yeah, we passed this law to ban TikTok." What they're really saying is, "Yeah, we've given up our moral authority, and we're encouraging all other governments, including those who are repressive regimes that we are bashing, and saying, go for it, do what we're doing, and maybe you want to even take it and innovate further."
Mm. Mm. That's powerful. So, question, there's evidence, or I mean, it's true that TikTok's equivalent in China, Douyin, does operate differently than it does than TikTok does outside of China. Out of the box, it has youth mode, limiting the use to 40 minutes per day. Kids can't look at it from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Is that type of evidence still just it? I think that type of evidence contributes to this idea that China is manipulating the algorithm. Like if TikTok works differently in other countries, then how is it working for us? And how is that affecting us as users differently? Does,
I guess there's an underlying premise there, which is that the other regulations are the right ones and that TikTok's the wrong one. And I
Mhm.
might flip that around and say that the starting premise ought to be that technology is neither good nor bad, and that we need to then help educate users and give them nudges towards the good uses and try to look for ways to ameliorate the bad or to ameliorate the effects of the bad.
Mhm.
Um, and so, whenever if you look globally across all countries, like all the countries are dictating how people can talk to each other online. That's just become the standard. So things like setting time limits or whatever, like there might be people who benefit from that, and there's surely communities who don't, and there's a whole bunch of other people who are getting around it. And so, like, what is that really doing? Who are the winners and losers and something like that? I don't know.
Mhm.
And I would question whether or not that's actually the better model that we ought to be addressing. And here in the United States, the starting premise has been for a very long time that if some publisher of software is coming up with solutions that they think address the marketplace, we're going to start with the premise they get to do that. And
Mhm.
so the idea that China or many other governments across the globe are intervening on that software publisher's freedom is actually, to me, a cautionary tale more
Mm.
than damning evidence.
Okay. All right. You're changing my mind right now, so I'm happy about that.